Greetings. I'm Newell Williams, president of Brite Divinity School. It is my privilege to welcome you to this panel discussion of Christian, Islamic, and Jewish perspectives on ecology. This discussion is funded by the Lewis and Frida Cristol Endowment for Academic Programming in Jewish Studies. This generous endowment was established by Dr. and Mrs. Joseph Selman of Tyler, Texas, to honor the parents of Mrs. Selman and her brothers, David and Charles Cristol. Introducing the members of our panel and moderating the discussion is Dr. Ariel Feldman, Rosalind and Manny Rosenthal, Associate Professor of Judaic Studies and Director of Brite's Jewish Studies program. Welcome.
Welcome to our Spring Crystal Lecture, friends. This special event is in many ways a joint effort. Thank you for being here. The idea to put together a series of mini lectures featuring different faith perspectives on a given topic was suggested to me by Dr. Michael Miller. Rabbi Mecklenburger is to be credited with the suggestion to choose ecology as the topic for this forthcoming panel. And of course, this event would not be possible without our distinguished speakers, Rabbi Ralph Mecklenburger, Dr. Timothy Robinson, and Dr. Samuel Ross, who have kindly agreed to speak on the topic. The plan for today is very simple. I introduce the three speakers, and then each of them will have about 15 minutes, we hope, to present their take on our theme. Rabbi Mecklenburger will speak first, followed by Dr. Robinson and then Dr. Ross. We would very much appreciate your questions and comments, which the speakers will address at the very end of our event. So please feel free to send those questions via questions and answers tool or via chat. I'll do my best to collect them and present them to the relevant speaker at the end. Now to brief introductions. It is my pleasure to welcome tonight Rabbi Ralph Mecklenburger. Rabbi Mecklenburger, who holds an honorary doctorate from the Hebrew Union College, has served Bethel congregation in Fort Worth since 1984. In addition to a busy job at his congregation, Rabbi Mecklenburger has often taught at Brite Divinity School and served as the chair of the Texas Conference on Churches Jewish Christian Forum. Somehow, he also found the time to write. His most recent book is titled Why Call It God? Theology for the Age of Science. I turn now to Dr. Timothy Robinson, Alberta and Harold Langer Associate Professor of Spiritual Disciplines and Resources at Brite Divinity School. At Brite, his research and teaching interests include the history of Christian spirituality, mysticism, ecotheology, the intersections of spirituality and social engagement, and he's an author of multiple articles and books, including Spirit and Nature, the study of Christian spirituality in a time of ecological urgency. Our third distinguished speaker is Dr. Samuel Ross, who teaches and researches Islam at Texas Christian University. Among his areas of interest are Quranic studies, Qur'an commentary literature, and Muslim-Christian relationships. He is currently working on a monograph exploring Qur'an commentators' engagement with the Bible. It is called The Biblical Turn in the Qur'an commentary tradition. He's also published several important books on the classical Arabic grammar. Thank you, speakers, for accepting this invitation. We will now turn to Rabbi Mecklenburger.
Thank you, Dr. Feldman. I was very flattered when Dr. Feldman invited me to participate in this interfaith symposium. The honor of teaching and speaking on various occasions at Brite Divinity School periodically over the years has meant a great deal to me, and it still does. Our topic, ecology, the environment, is one which I have felt strongly about for as long as I can remember. When I was ordained nearly half a century ago now, had someone asked me, you're probably any other newly minted rabbi of any denomination, about Jewish attitudes towards the environment, I or they would have turned almost instinctively to the wonderful Hebrew Bible passages about the awesome wonder of creation, and we still should. The earth is the Lord's and all that it holds, the world and those who dwell in it, Psalm 24 begins. Or Psalm 19 begins, The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament, the sky, shows God's handiwork. The poet who produced the book of Job goes on for chapters at the end, rhapsodizing over the wonders of God's world and stressing that we mortals have scarcely a clue how God created it or pulls off all its intricate workings. Some of it we will recall. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Asked God. Declare if you have understanding. Where is the way to the dwelling of light? And as for darkness, where is the place thereof? Have you entered the treasuries of the snow and the hoarfrost? Who gathered it? On and on, wild ox and ostrich and hawk, land and sea monsters, food for all of them. Never mind that we do understand some of what were mysteries in biblical times. For now we wonder at a universe trillions of miles across. They never imagined that. And a subatomic world which seems to operate by rules not at all intuitive to our human minds. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the world still leaves us stammering in ignorance. A tiny coronavirus, we all know all too well, can catch us flat-footed. From our biblical roots to our reading of modern science, Jewish tradition, and I suspect the whole Abrahamic family of religions, senses the hand of God in nature. Ecology, the way it all comes together in our experience, and hopefully the way it comes together in our thriving and the natural world's thriving, should also be recognized as holy, something real in our lives which evokes our sense of the divine. Still, it was already becoming increasingly apparent half a century ago that humanity in the modern world was abusing the ecosystem. There was a great deal of talk about overpopulation, and there still is some. Heating of the environment seems to have taken over as the main topic, but consider the population of the world is estimated to have been about 150 million people at the end of biblical times. By the beginning of the 20th century, that 150 million had grown to 1.5 billion. And today, 120 years later, we are nearly 8 billion. Our garbage has become a problem. The atmosphere, we all know this, air, lakes and oceans, prairies, mountains, grow increasingly polluted. Natural habitats in seas and on land have been disappearing as the human imprint spreads all over the place. In the last couple of decades, scientists have more and more urgently warned us against the growing danger of climate change. And I know some are skeptical about the topic, but few in the scientific world are skeptical. And the multiplication of extreme weather catastrophes, from hurricanes and massive wildfires to our recent frigid temperatures right here in Texas, suggest, to put it mildly, that the worldwide community must urgently change our ways to keep the planet livable. Over the years, I have repeatedly heard the argument that humanity's neglect of environmental responsibility is in significant measure the fault of Genesis and the creation story itself, that we Jews and Christians, and I think Muslims too, hold sacred. Specifically, in Genesis 1, God created the world, the rest of the world. God said, let the whole world, and then at the end, let us make the human in our image after our likeness. They shall rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, the cattle, the whole earth, and all creeping things that creep on the earth. So God does so for another couple of verses. And then it says to the humans, be fertile and fill the earth and master it. That's the problem, the critics have said. The Bible says we are in charge and we can do whatever we wish. So let's look more closely. What exactly do rule the animals and master the earth mean in the context of biblical literature? In nature, is nature ours to exploit and pollute any way we wish? In the very next chapter, of course, the man is placed in the Garden of Eden, la'avda u'lashomra, which my Jewish Publication Society translation makes a little more elegant as to till it and to tend it. And some others render to dress it and to keep it. What the Hebrew text literally says, though, is simply to work it and to guard it. The guard part is from the same root, shamar, as the word for a military guard or the police. Yes, we could eat from the garden, as could other creatures, but according to the creation stories, we have a job to do. Take care of creation, guard it, let no harm befall it. We should be very careful about accusing biblical generations thousands of years ago. After all, how primitive we might think. We should be careful about accusing them of ignorance, of having no idea of ecosystems or dangers to the environment. Obviously, they did not have our sophistication when it comes to science, but they were keen observers. There are multiple environmental commandments in the Torah. Soldiers in the field had to bury their waste. They could cut down trees to make siege works, but not fruit trees. Fruit, after all, would be needed later when it was over for food. And the Deuteronomist implores, are trees of the field human to withdraw from you into the besieged city? If you were out in the field and came upon a bird, a nest, with the mother sitting on eggs or on the young, you could take the fledglings or the eggs, but you had to send the mother forth, or again, there wouldn't be food for the next generation. Even the land should rest periodically, the sabbatical year, perhaps so it could regenerate, a sort of step towards crop rotation, and clearly, because it is not ours to do with as we please, it is God's. Interdependence of living things, that's ecology. Psalm 104 is all about the wonders of nature, mountains and the springs that run down them, moon and stars and thus seasons, animals, light and dark. Ma rabu ma'asecha Adonai, kulam b'chochma asita, it says, how many are your works, O God, with wisdom you have made them all. The earth is full of your creatures. Cycles in nature. Try Ecclesiastes 1. The sun rises and the sun sets and glides back to where it rises. All streams flow to the sea, yet the sea is never full. To the place from which they flow, the streams flow back again. Science has grown more sophisticated, but the values, those basic sorts of lessons, certainly remain. Jewish thought, moreover, continues to evolve post-biblically. Prophecy seems to have ended with the biblical epic, but as we move into the rabbinic era some 2,000 years ago, the rabbis were convinced that God continued to speak with us through the sacred texts, interpretation being the replacement of prophecy. We read scripture now to see what God wants us to do. Essentially, the rabbis went on to develop a legal tradition. It's called halakha, the way, the heart of which is the Talmud, literally, but which continues in an interpretive tradition which still goes on in our time. And the same rabbis had their interpretations of scripture and holidays, their sermons and stories about great characters contemporary to them and biblical characters as well. to inspire themselves and new generations, and that is known as midrash. We should touch on both to get a picture of Jewish attitudes towards ecology and the environment in our time. There is a principle in Jewish law known as Bal Tashchit, you shall not destroy. 12th century scholar Maimonides, renowned as a legal scholar even before he became famous as a philosopher, takes the prohibition against cutting down fruit trees that I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, against cutting them down in wartime, as a precedent. Fruit trees in the countryside are not to be wantonly destroyed in peacetime either. The same applies to other plant life, to animals, and even to inanimate objects. Halachic scholar Moshe Zemer summarizes, Bal Tashchit sets the outer limits of the enfranchisement given to us to utilize all the resources of nature for human purposes. When we cross these boundaries and demolish the works of God, we lose our delicate equilibrium with nature. Thus, from biblical foundations and through today, Judaism sees the world and thus the environment as holy, as sacred, and humanity as privileged to enjoy it and be part of it and guard it for subsequent generations. A mystical rabbi in the Babylonian Talmud itself, codified in the 6th century CE, famously comes across a man planting a carob tree. How long does it take for this tree to bear fruit? The rabbi asks. 70 years, the man replies. Are you confident that you will live another 70 years? Asks the rabbi. And the man responds, I found carob trees in the world as my ancestors planted for me. So I too plant for my children. Now, however long it takes for this or that variety of tree to reach maturity, I'm a little skeptical about it taking 70 years for a carob tree, but I'm not a farmer. The value that's there is crystal clear. Nature is not a gift to be squandered, but a blessing to respect and pass along. We have to tend this garden that we are in. We're not doing a very good job of it these days. That is plainly not a new concern. What is new is the realization that the planet could literally cease to be habitable if humanity does not quickly learn to do far better. And to put an exclamation point on all of this, my favorite passage on humanity's role in creation comes from the Midrash, Ecclesiastes Rabbah, an 8th century collection. When the Holy One created the first man, he took him and led him all around the trees of the Garden of Eden and said to him, Behold my works, how beautiful and commendable they are. All that I have created, for your sake I created it. Pay heed that you do not corrupt and destroy my world. For if you corrupt and destroy my world, there is no one to repair it after you. Amen to that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Mecklenburger. We will have to do some fact checking on carob tree, but that's for later. We appreciate your comments. And now we will move to our next speaker, Dr. Timothy Robinson.
Thank you, Rabbi Mecklenburger. You laid out our ecological situation in some very stark and clear ways, so that I do not have to do so in my talk. We know where we are at, and you've lifted up some very lovely and prescient passages from the Hebrew Bible, which we share across our traditions as we think about this vital issue together. I would like to begin with a couple of quotes, consider them if you were reading this as a chapter, epigraphs at the beginning of the chapter. The first is by Liberty Hyde Bailey. If God created the earth, so is the earth hallowed. And if it is hallowed, so must we deal with it devotedly and with care, that we do not despoil it, and mindful of all our relations to all beings that live on it. The second is from Howard Thurman. And I'm translating his early 20th century masculine language into more inclusive language. So forgive the awkwardness of this. The human is a child of nature. The human is rooted and grounded in the earth. The human belongs to it, and it belongs to the human. The human cannot long separate itself from nature without withering as a cut rose in a vase. One of the deceptive aspects of the mind in the human is to give the human the illusion of being distinct from and over against, but not a part of, nature. It is but a single leap thus to regard nature as being so completely other than the human self that one may exploit it, plunder it, and rape it with impunity. This we see all around us in the modern world. Our atmosphere is polluted, our streams are poisoned, our hills are denuded, wildlife is increasingly exterminated, while more and more the human becomes alien on the earth, and the fowler of our own nest. The first quote is from a 1915 book by Liberty Hyde Bailey called This Holy Earth. Bailey was an influential American botanist and sometimes called the grandfather of American horticulture, taught at Cornell University, and was deeply shaped by the Protestant social gospel Christianity. The second quote is by the African-American mystic and theologian Howard Thurman, who taught at Boston University School of Theology, among other places. And the quote comes from an address and later book that originally he formulated in the 1930s and was later published in the 1960s. I will return to these quotes in a few minutes. Before digging into our subject proper, however, I feel the need to begin with what one of our colleagues, I'm speaking to Dr. Feldman and Dr. Williams, one of our colleagues at Brite, calls academic throat clearing. Any attempt to offer an overview of Christianity and ecology, the task with which I have been given this evening, has to acknowledge that there is not a single view. There is no such single thing as Christianity, which we can look to for a Christian understanding of anything. On the one hand, from an ecclesiastical standpoint, there are several major branches or streams of Christian tradition, commonly understood as Roman Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, itself a diverse collection of national churches, and Protestant. Again, a diverse collection of churches ranging from, say, high liturgical and socially progressive Episcopal Church in the United States to the free church liturgical communions that are rather conserving politically and theologically. For example, the Southern Baptists. To an enormously diverse set of non-denominational and congregationally oriented fellowships. Each of these various traditions has developed their own responses to ecological and environmental matters in recent decades. For example, in the now well-known encyclical Laudato Si, the 2015 publication that Pope Francis issued calling for an ecological conversion, in the Pope's words, for Christianity, that earned him the moniker, the Green Pope. Not many recall these days that the previous two popes, Benedict and John Paul II, also issued substantial teachings on care for the earth that in their days earned them also the same title, the Green Popes. The ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew, the spiritual leader of the world's 300 million Orthodox Christians, has long been known as the Green Patriarch. In 1997, Patriarch Bartholomew became one of the first worldwide religious leaders to denounce environmental abuse as a sin against God, humanity, and nature. In 2002, Patriarch Bartholomew proclaimed the refusal to treat creation properly as a gift of communion with God and one another is humanity's original sin. And in 2017, as Protestants around the world marked the 500th anniversary of the beginnings of the Protestant Reformation in Europe, a group of Lutheran theologians published a book of essays calling for an ecological reformation of Christianity. Most Christian denominations have produced some kind of statement on the environment or on climate change or on climate refugees and on all of the challenges that we face now that are ecologically related. You can usually locate those statements at the various denominational websites. Further, and finally, I promise not to do this overview all evening, within any particular manifestation of Christian church, that is, say, the United Methodist denomination or the Roman Catholic Church, there are widely diverse theological orientations among both professional theologians and among your average churchgoer. I say all of this simply to alert us that whatever I say this evening about a Christian perspective on ecology will be only one particular perspective on the matter. On the other hand, I've named sort of the denominational ecclesiastical dimensions of it. On the other hand, while various denominations and parachurch and interfaith organizations provide a wealth of resources for Christian prayer and worship and education and activism around ecological matters, there's a body of academic literature, an academic field that reflects on the religious and moral dimensions of ecology as well. And I'm going to focus on the academic field of ecotheology, partly because that's what I know best, and also because it is both informed by Christian practice and in turn informs Christian attitudes and practices around ecological matters. The subfield within Christian theological studies known as ecotheology has emerged over the last 6 decades. It's coincident with the emergence of mainstream environmental movements in thinking about the human-earth relationship in philosophy, economics, political science, etc. What I would like to try to do in our brief time together is, focusing on the academic field of ecotheology, offer a broad overview of some of the ways that diverse Christians engage with ecological or environmental realities, how contemporary ecological science, ecological crisis, and the climate crisis, and the social dimensions of these realities informs Christian thought and practice today. If what we know as the field of religion ecology or Christian ecotheology is a relatively young endeavor, in the formal sense, Christian consideration of the more than human world has a much longer history. I call your attention back to the quotes with which I began. They show that Christian persons, some formal theologians and clergy, some just regular laypersons concerned about spiritual and ecological matters, have been thinking about the spiritual significance of the more than human world, the relationship of God to nature, and the human treatment of the more than human world for a long time. In fact, we can find these concerns expressed throughout the history of Christian thought and practice. Christian historians and theologians often look to the desert fathers and mothers, for instance, to see how A, their physical surroundings, the landscapes they inhabited, mirrored their interior spiritual landscapes, and B, how they interacted with the land, its fauna, its flora, in sustainable and mutually enriching ways. Ancient medieval Ancient and medieval Benedictine monasteries are often regarded as models of sustainable and co-creative development in relation to the natural world. Saint Francis of Assisi, of course, who many, including Pope Francis, have termed the patron saint of ecology, composed the fabulous Canticle of the Creatures, a hymn of praise to God in which all elements of creation join the human in worship, and serves as the basis for the popular Christian hymn, All Creatures of Our God and King. Francis was one of many medieval saints about whom legends are recorded of their interactions with animals. Think about his preaching to the birds, or his rebuke of a fierce wolf who subsequently repents of terrorizing a town and agrees to live in harmony with the humans there. In these tales, the animals respond to the saints, reflecting both the saints' holiness and the ways in which the original perfection of Eden and the harmony of creation is restored. The more than human creatures were seen to be fellow participants with humans in the economy of grace. They were capable of praising God and capable of exercising virtue. The 12th century German abbess Hildegard of Bingen has been named an ecological prophet because of her organic, holistic vision of the cosmos and her emphasis on viriditas. That's her term, which means fecundity, or the greening power, the power of life pulsing through the universe. And the 16th century Protestant reformer John Calvin, not thought of often as an ecological prophet, certainly, affirmed the presence of God in all things, that God's glory irradiates all of creation. Calvin used metaphors to describe God's presence in all things. The universe is the glorious garment, as he called it, in which God wraps God's self in order to be seen, to be visible to humans. It is the dazzling theater, said Calvin, of God's glory. Calvin subscribed to a long Christian tradition about the twin books of Revelation, that is, the book of nature and the book of Scripture, each bearing witness to knowledge of God and each necessary to properly understanding the other. In each of the major expressions of Christianity, Orthodoxy, Roman Catholicism, and Protestantism, there are traditions in which the natural world is regarded as sacramental, that is, revealing the sacred, mediating God's presence, possessing the ability to lead humans into encounter with the divine. So there's a long history in Christianity of regarding the more than human world as of sacred or spiritual importance, as being hallowed by God as good, as being the locus of divine knowledge. Part of the work of contemporary ecotheology is to retrieve these traditions and to remind us of these traditions. However, it is also true that these traditions, while robust, have been seen as sort of, if you will, the minority report over the past few hundred years. They have not been central in Christian theological reflection, certainly not in the West. That is, the Earth's ecology, the universe itself, and the more than human world in which we live and move and breathe, and on which we depend for our physical, our very material existence, has not been at the center of theological reflection. And for the past few hundred years, the earth itself has not often been regarded as bearing either divine presence or theological importance. For much of the time since the Reformation, Protestant Reformation, and especially since the time of the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution, certainly among Protestants in the West, theological reflection has centered on humans, human salvation, human responsibilities toward other humans. The earth itself has been regarded most often as merely the stage or the backdrop upon which the human drama of salvation is played out. Until recently, Christian theology has never been organized in such a way that the earth, or the creation, if you will, itself was at the core or the center of the theological project. Or as the late Roman Catholic theologian Dennis Edwards put it in the title of one of his books, we have not seen ecology at the heart of faith. It is only in the context of increasing human awareness of the effects of industrialization, of the massive use of carbon-based fuels that on the planet, that the earth, the ecosystems that sustain life, have become central to theological reflection. For our current context raises serious questions about human nature, what it means for the divine-human relationship that humans are decimating so much of the ecological systems that our scriptures tell us God created, pronounced good, and charged humans with caring for. It raises fundamental questions about the future of life on our planet, human and more than human. One of the tasks of contemporary thought about Christianity's relationship with the more than human world is to attempt to retrieve those minority reports that speak to us of the sacred importance of the more than human world and human embeddedness within it and responsibility for it. I just wanted to briefly identify, I know that my time is basically up, but I'll identify 4 areas of concern for contemporary Christian eco-theologians, and perhaps we can return to these in the conversation time. This is not an exhaustive list, but I hope it offers a sense of how contemporary thinkers are rendering the relationship between Christianity and ecology. First is the relationship of God to the natural world. Second is the human place within and responsibility towards the more than human world. Third is the social dimensions of the environmental crisis, by which I mean dealing with the history of colonial appropriations of indigenous lands in Africa and Asia and the Americas by Europeans, and the consequences of that, as well as the unequal distribution of environmental hazards and benefits that are rooted in race and class, especially in race. And then finally, the future of planetary life in the current state of affairs, and the current state of affairs and the nature of hope. What theological reflection on what the future holds and how we might engage the issue of hope as we look toward the future. I have several more pages, but I'm going to stop there because I've used my time, and perhaps we can come back to that in the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Robinson. Thank you very much. We now move to Dr. Samuel Ross. Sam, all yours.
Okay, I'm just going to share my screen here. Just one moment. Let's get this going and make sure this works properly. Let's see. So I think if I do this and I do this, let's see, and then I want to go. Is this working? Are you able to see my slide? I see a thumbs up.
This is perfect. Thank you.
Okay, great. Great. Okay. Let's put this here. Okay. Well, so many people to thank. I don't know. There's so many different ways I could thank, different priorities I could, or different orders I could use. I'll first reach out and thank Ariel for organizing tonight's event. I want to thank Brite Divinity School and the donors who made this event possible. My fellow panelists, Rabbi Mecklenburger and Dr. Robinson. It's a pleasure to be on the panel with you. And Rabbi Mecklenburger, I can feel 50 years of homiletic excellence in your voice. You're very skilled, and Dr. Robinson, you're very knowledgeable about this topic, far more than I. So I'm very excited to be able to participate, even if a bit sort of intimidated and humbled. So I was asked to speak about Islamic perspectives on ecology, and I would echo what Dr. Robinson said, which is that, of course, just as in the Christian tradition, it's almost impossible to speak of quote unquote an Islamic perspective in the Muslim world being 1.8 billion people and having numerous, I guess if we use the word denominations, perhaps. But I wanted to sort of emphasize that one of the reasons I'm very excited that we're having a discussion about this, and I thank you, Rabbi Mecklenburger, for suggesting the topic, is that I think religion really has an important role to play on this question of the environmental crisis, catastrophe, call it what you will. Here, for example, the projection from the World Health Organization that by 2030, 2050, we might be seeing an additional 250,000 deaths every year as a consequence of the climate crisis. The Lancet journal, the British journal, recently suggested maybe closer to 500,000. And I think it's probably fair to say it's potentially maybe the greatest challenge humanity has ever faced. Even COVID, you think about COVID now and all of the ways it's dominated our lives and dominated the headlines. And at the end of the day, what did COVID require? It required some technological savvy to make a vaccine. We already knew how to make vaccines. We just had to make a new one for a new virus. We had to be patient and wear a mask. And some of us be patient if we lost our jobs, and very sadly. But the climate crisis, we need technologies. We don't even have a way to do it yet. Carbon capture at a commercial scale doesn't even really exist. It's an extraordinary challenge, and it goes right to the core of who we are as humans and our weaknesses as humans, our predilection for greed, our predilection for self-centeredness, our predilection to disregard others, our laziness. I'm speaking for myself, but I think these are widely regarded human foibles, and they all get in the way. And I think many people, many thoughtful people, have noted that you're only really going to have a change that's meaningful if humanity collectively changes its values. And values is, in many ways, the domain of religion. Here's a quote I like from James Speth, the former head of the United Nations Development Program, that the potential of faith communities is enormous. And I really believe that. I really believe that these kinds of conversations are extraordinarily important. So I wanted just to say a couple of quick introductory words. I think, I'm guessing for many people who might be listening, sort of Muslim perspectives might be a little farther outside the normal radar. I wanted just to say a couple of quick things about how grateful I am that Dr. Feldman Ariel asked me to speak, or not me personally, but asked to include Islamic perspectives on this topic, because I think the Muslim world has a really important role to play for a variety of reasons. Here's a sort of map of the Muslim world. Obviously, Muslims live in almost every country on earth as immigrants in some places, but sort of majority Muslim world on the screen. But in terms of population, the Muslim world is about a quarter of the world population and is expected to grow to maybe a third of the world population, equaling the number of Christians in our lifetimes by 2070. So it's inconceivable that a global problem affecting all of humanity could be realistically solved without the involvement of 1/3 of the planet, of the Muslim world. And I also think it's significant because I think the Muslim world, generally being part of the global South, is likely to be disproportionately affected by climate change. Here, for example, is a climate change vulnerability index, and you can see that I've kind of highlighted in general the majority Muslim world in the red box, and it's significantly more vulnerable than North America or Europe, for example. Look at some other indices. Water stress is extremely high in the Muslim world. I remember I lived in Jordan for several years, and I would see this massive pipe being built from Amman all the way down to Saudi Arabia to extract water from an aquifer, which of course is only a temporary solution and doesn't refill that quickly. Projected effects of GDP, very negative in the Muslim world. Mortality expectations in the Muslim world, again, higher than lots of Northern Europe and the United States. So I think the Muslim world is likely to be very impacted. A very visual example is the Maldives. It's not a huge country, but it's a very visual example. This is about 500,000 people live in the Maldives. The whole country is about 5 feet above sea level. You can imagine 1.5 meters. And here's some projections from NOAA, and they're saying that maybe by 2100, an intermediate projection is somewhere on the order of maybe 1 meter and maybe intermediate high. It's very conceivable that within the coming century, the sea will be higher than the country. And they're quickly building, a wall to protect it, like a 3-meter wall that hopefully will last a while. But this is dire. And also the Muslim world that has a huge role to play because there's a lot of biodiversity. Here's like a biodiversity hotspot map. I've highlighted Southeast Asia on the right, South Asia and Southeast Asia, which might not seem like a very big place, but demographically, half the Muslim world lives here. They say that half the Muslim world lives east of Karachi, Pakistan. Indonesia having a huge amount of biodiversity and being the largest Muslim country in terms of population. So I think that's another consideration. And another interesting aspect too, is that I think in general, and public polling has shown this, that in the Muslim world, not obviously everywhere, but to a large extent, religion remains very important in many people's lives. Here, for example, is some Gallup polling data. The percentage of people who say religion is very important. And if you look at the red zone, it's a lot of it's in the 90%. And some, it's kind of mind-boggling given the trajectory that we might be more familiar with here in America or parts of Europe. But when they do surveys, Egypt, 97% of people report that religion is very important. Indonesia, 98% of people told Gallup that religion is very important to them. And what that means is if religion is very important, then when religious authorities speak about the environment, people listen. And there's some really good examples we can maybe talk about later. I just kind of want to mention that by way of introduction, that I'm really grateful that this was included. In terms of Islamic perspectives, again, as I think Rabbi Mecklenburger and Dr. Robinson would echo, I mean, the field of sort of thinking about religion and ecology, or religion and the environment, is obviously a relatively new development. I was looking in the dictionary, and the word ecology seems to have popped up, and I can be corrected on this, but maybe in the 1870s, I saw it first cited by Ernst Haeckel, the German biologist. And so as a consequence, it's, when you read sort of the founding fathers of the Islamic discipline, they describe sort of, being in their, the 1970s and 80s and thinking about these things and not knowing where to turn. And so the field is relatively young. I have some examples of books on the screen here that were some prominent recent examples in English. But I kind of wanted us to highlight a few themes, and it was really exciting listening to Rabbi Mecklenburger and Dr. Robinson, because a lot of the same themes are shared here, I think, which is not surprising given the close proximities or the close affinities of Islam and Judaism and Christianity. But first, as noted in both presentations, I think a common theme you'll find in Muslim writings about Islam and the environment is the very obvious fact that the universe belongs to God. The Quranic verse, "Unto God belongs all that is all that is in the heavens and in the earth." And that's significant, because what that means is it means that humans are guests. We live here, we're accustomed to living here, but at the end of the day, we don't own the house. And that actually is a nice, that's good connection there, because I think the word ecology comes from the Greek word oik, meaning house, right? It's a perfect term there. And so we don't own the house. And so I think, many Muslim theologians would say that, effectively, when a human being, declares dominion over a piece of territory on earth and begins to defile it and pollute it, I mean, it's almost akin to someone going into, being invited into someone's house. You go as a guest to someone's home, you sit on the couch, and you need to blow your nose. So you start maybe like ripping up the fabric on the couch. And then you blow your nose, and then you kind of, what do I do with this thing? And you stick it in the couch cushions, right? In this person's home you're visiting. Like, this is disgusting behavior, right? How could you do this? Or if you were sitting on the couch in someone's home, it's a 3-seat couch, and then you announce, well, this has become my couch because I'm the one who's sitting here, and so you can't sit on the end of the couch because this is my couch. The owner of the couch would say, the owner of the house would say, "What are you talking about? You're my guest. You have no right to deny my other guest from sitting on my couch." But in many ways, that's how human beings behave. So I think that's one important theme: the idea that the universe ultimately belongs to God and that humanity are guests. And I think an interesting another thing we might also note is, and actually I have a typo here. This is actually Quran, but actually it's a hadith of the Prophet, meaning a saying of the Prophet. An idea that the earth is for everyone. There's a saying of Muhammad that he who has land should cultivate it. If he will not or cannot, he should give it free to his Muslim brother, and that would mean fellow human being, and not rent it to him, which is a really remarkable, ethos. And I think in some ways it's an ethos that my sense is was very common in the pre-modern world, in an era, before, but not even pre-modern. I mean, the ancient world, where many people had an idea of communal land or communal grazing land. Not the sort of, post-Roman idea of, owning a personal property deed and keeping people off your land, even if you're doing nothing with it. There's a sense here that if you're not making active use of it, share it. And this has implications actually in Islamic law, which is of course one of the great disciplines of sort of the Islamic tradition. You actually can find debates among medieval jurists. Is someone who has quote unquote owns land but is not using it, do they have a right to it? It's actually kind of mind-boggling to think about. Or similarly, there's an understanding in Islamic law that sort of readily. Well, maybe I'll skip that. In the time, I'll keep going. Okay. A third major idea, I think something comparable to what one might find in the Psalms, and I'd love to hear Rabbi Mecklenburger's take on this. But a constant theme in the Quran is the idea of nature as a sign of God. The word in Arabic is an ayah, or an ayat in the plural. Here's an important verse. "Verily, in the creation of the heavens and the earth, and the succession of night and day, and in the waters which God sends down from the sky, giving life thereby to the earth after it had been lifeless, and causing all manner of living creatures to multiply thereon, and in the change of the winds and the clouds that run their appointed courses between sky and earth, there are messages, or you can say signs, that's the word, same word, indeed for those who reflect. If you go through the Quran, there are dozens and dozens and dozens, perhaps even hundreds of verses that talk about the natural world, and there's this idea of signs. Or you can use a fancy term, that the universe is semiotic. It has a message for us. It's not simply something that is there to be measured, to be commodified, to be exploited, to be sold. It's to be contemplated. It's trying to tell us something. And what is it trying to tell us? Among the things it's trying to tell us, you might hear Muslim mystics or Muslim theologians speak of the earth as almost like a mirror of God's divine qualities, so that you can behold, you can get a sense of God's majesty in the earth, and God's power in the earth, and God's gentleness in the earth, and God's love in the earth, and God's wisdom and knowledge, and all of these qualities that the Quran describes him as having in the natural world. Which also means that when humans defile the earth, it's like you're smudging up the mirror, and people can no longer behold the divine. It also means that if, some people, and it's also, I should also say, it's interesting that the word ayah, used for sign in the sense of a natural sign, is this same exact word used for a verse in the Quran. So you could even speak metaphorically of, the book of God in the sense of the scripture book, the Quran, for example, and the book of nature, just kind of like Galileo-like, right? The book of nature and the book of God. But if you think about what that entails, if nature is the book of God, then when human beings just, do strip mining of mountains, it's like you're erasing God's book. What an audacious thing for a human being to do. Okay, so another idea I wanted to mention, which I think also Rabbi Mecklenburger, hinted at in this discussion of the Psalms, an idea that nature praises God. The seven heavens extol his limitless glory, and the earth and all that they contain, and there is not a single thing but extols, the Arabic is yusabbihu, his limitless glory and praise. But you, that's humanity, fail to grasp the manner of their glorifying him. Verily, he is forbearing, much forgiving. A sense that the natural world is engaged in the praise of God. And there's a nice story I heard. I think it's a nice illustration of this. There's a famous story. I don't know if it's famous, but there's a story that's told of a Muslim mystic, a Sufi master, who was tasked with the responsibility of appointing a successor. And so the question is, as you can imagine, he has to devise some sort of test to determine which of his disciples should take on the mantle of leading the order. And so he gives a command, sends out his disciples to go and bring back the most beautiful flower that you can find. And so this disciples scatter, looking into the forests and meadows for flowers they can bring back. And they slowly return with beautiful flowers. You can imagine, I don't know, daffodils and roses and tulips and things like this. But there's one disciple who's taking his time and not coming back. And the other disciples begin to think, like, what's up with this person? Why is he taking his time? And finally, he returns with an old dead flower. And they're sort of outraged. Like, how could you bring this to the master? He asked us to bring the most beautiful flower, and you brought the most dead flower we could find. And he explains himself and said, I saw all these beautiful flowers worshiping God, but this one had ceased, and so I brought it back. In the sense of, I did not want to interrupt nature's worship of God. And if I had picked a live, beautiful flower, I would have done so. And the master says, you shall take over the mantle of the sheikh. Is it apocryphal? Is it true? I don't know. But I think it's a nice illustration of the idea that there is this, and I should even also note, as it's kind of a side comment, you can read sometimes in sort of autobiographical writings of mystics who have these ecstatic experiences. There's an Egyptian mystic, Abdul Wahhab al-Sha'rani, who described actually entering an ecstatic state where he says he heard the praise of nature. I don't know what that means. I've never had that experience of beholding or hearing nature praising God, but that's how he described it. And then so I'm sensitive to time. I need to sort of wrap up here, but maybe two final thoughts. Another, I think, important idea that comes out in the Hadith corpus, which is the sayings of Muhammad, the teachings of the traditions of Muhammad. You have a lot of hadiths that talk about the importance of caring for the natural world. And here's two kind of contrasting takes on this. So a saying of the Prophet, and this is in Sahih Bukhari, which for Sunni Muslims, the majority of Muslims today, is the most authentic book of hadith. No Muslim plants a tree or sows a seed, and then a bird or a human or an animal eats from it, but that it is almsgiving, sadaqah for him. Which is, I think, a remarkable statement, because it's basically saying that you can do a good deed, as it were, not only in feeding a human or caring for humans, but for feeding an animal. That if a bird comes and eats from it, God is pleased by that, and God rewards that. And then similarly, also, like by contrast, there is no person who kills a small bird or anything larger without just reason, but God, the mighty and sublime, will ask him about it and the implied is on the day of judgment. And so you have these debates in Muslim scholarly literature, about, for example, are you allowed to kill pests? Can you kill ants and can you kill centipedes and things like this? And generally they made allowances for killing things that were dangerous, but there was an understanding that you can't just kill an animal for no reason. And to the point even, again, I'll pick on Abdul Wahab Ash'arani, describes his own teacher, who would leave food in his house. And when asked, why do you leave food in your house? He said, I'm worried that the ants might go into the street and get trampled by the passing wagons. So if I feed them in my house, they won't be subject to being killed, which I think is a nice statement of that sort of an ethos. So I think I'm out of time. I'll stop here, but I look forward to the conversation and any questions that might come up. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ross. And thank you, three speakers, for your presentations. They've been wonderful, interesting, stimulating. We'll be waiting for some questions to come in. As they're still coming, I was thinking of one question I would ask you if you would like to address it in whatever order you would like to. If you're thinking about the conversation in general right now in our respective traditions, what might be missing? What do you think? What should be there and we don't have it?
That's a very good question. I have to ponder that for a moment.
Sure, that's for all of us to consider. I don't have any good answer. I'm just having the fun of asking the question.
Can I jump in? What has been present is this sense of awe at God's splendid work. What is missing is not just our religious recognition that we'd better take care of all of this, but power. The economics of the thing get in the way, and the religious community can preach all day, but there are enough deniers that the progress, even there, and there is progress, but it's painfully slow.
Thank you very much, Ralph.
I would echo that. When I go into Christian congregations to talk about, these issues, somehow, maybe I'm not doing it right, but somehow I often get the comments afterwards that say something like, "Oh, well, thank you for not making this political." And I think, really? This is political all the way down, right? So maybe what's missing is, this notion that somehow this is separate from issues of, as Rabbi Mecklenburger alluded to, matters of power, matters of economics, matters of political activism. It's not just about hugging trees. I hug trees. I talk to squirrels, and birds, and that's a part of the spirituality of nature and in our Abrahamic traditions, the sort of interaction with the more than human world. But there's no avoiding policy around these things. Like, how does our theology inform policy, which informs activism, which is matters of power, which is matters of being involved at that level to try to advocate for particular kinds of policies, trying to avoid partisan issues here. But there are particular policies that contribute to environmental or ecological flourishing and the human relationship with the more than human world. And there are particular policies that diminish that flourishing and those, we can't avoid those. So thank you, Rabbi, for naming that.
I would say that I think in the Islamic tradition, and I'm hesitant to speak about it so authoritatively, but I think that there's a lot that's missing. And I think part of the challenge is, I mean, to be quite frank, I think, to the extent that I think the environmental movement in general has been centered in North America and Europe, obviously it has global, implications and global audience, but I think the intellectual center thus far in terms of especially fields like developmental economics and sustainable development, and also the sciences themselves. I mean, the high level forestry studies and things like this has tended to be centered in North America and Europe, which is not a large place of Muslim settlement. I think the Muslim world is still in the process of engaging with these topics. A secondary issue also is that in the Muslim world, especially in the Middle East, for example, there's just, a lot of tyranny. I mean, it's one of the least democratic regions in the world as a consequence of, lots of monarchies, lots of dictatorships. I think on the democracy index that you typically will find this, you often rank the lowest in the world in terms of levels of democracy. And so as a consequence, it's, doing public policy is challenging because, the layperson doesn't have a lot of influence. So those are maybe a few observations.
Thank you very much.
Yeah,
And
just to jump in, if I could jump back in, just one of the things that I left out is around this matter, and I really appreciate Dr. Ross you saying that is that one of the key issues in talking about environmental or ecological justice is the participatory. Participation is a key principle in Christian environmental ethics around how matters are determined. And so of those 4 issues or 4 areas that I named, the social dimensions is kind of maybe speaks to that, is that Christian ecotheology is attendant to the human suffering caused by Western colonial practices. And those have coincided with Christian missionary activity to appropriate land, resources, and the labor of African, Asian, Caribbean, and American territory. So, what we call settler colonialism in North America, this violent takeover of the Americas and the destruction of its people and its cultures, were accomplished in the name of Christ and the church. So this is if we want to talk about Christianity and ecology, this is a big piece of it historically that we can't avoid. So, the enslavement of millions of Africans and others resulted in the economic prosperity of European settlers as we appropriated forced labor to transform the landscape, the ecology of the Americas for our economic gain, and it's economic prosperity that Americans enjoy today. And, we could go further into the unjust distribution of environmental hazards and benefits according to race and class. And, the fact that nations and peoples least responsible historically for climate change inducing emissions are going to suffer the greatest impacts of it with the fewest resources to address it. But, part of the, one dimension of Christian ecotheology is attempting to acknowledge those historical realities and naming them as sin. That's a theological dimension of it, and calling for confession and repentance, and calling for restitution, reparations, and the just distribution of environmental benefits and burdens across racial and class and gender and national lines. So, we've kind of stepped into it there in ways that we didn't quite get to in our initial presentations. But thank you for raising those important issues.
Thank you, friends. And changing gears slightly, a question from one of our attendees. Can you say more about how your different traditions understand how the non-human parts of creation are understood to praise the divine? Maybe we can start with Ralph, if you like, Ralph, and then move in the order we've presented. Non-human parts of creation praising divine. I think you're muted. You'll have to unmute yourself, Ralph.
Unmute. There we go. Here we get into the sort of thing that Dr. Robinson said so well about there not being one Christianity. There isn't one expression of any one of these traditions, including Judaism. The mystics really think that these, somewhat personified, it's pantheism usually, expressions of nature literally are praising God. Not being a mystic, as a modernist Reformed Jew, I think nature is revelatory in getting through to our sensitivities, in evoking our sense of awe, of, if holiness is that which a kadosh in Hebrew is to be set aside, if holiness is what we set aside for religious purposes, all right? We go to a national park, we get a sense of the holy, but we can also do that when there's a good sunset in Fort Worth. Right? So, religion gets through to us to make us realize the holiness of the whole system. That's the best I can do.
Thank you, Ralph. Tim or Sam, any observations on this topic?
This is a little lighthearted, but I heard an American Muslim scholar once muse. I think he was sort of speculating, but he was actually trying to incorporate quantum mechanics into explaining this phenomenon. And his argument was that if you believe in a wave-particle duality, and that particles can be thought of as waves and waves can be thought of as particles, and if we, in conventional human terms, think of the human voice, if you record it as a wave, right, and you get a wave function, then maybe in some mystical way only known to God, or mysterious way only known to God, the particles of the natural world and their wave functions are akin to someone recording hallelujah or something comparable. I think he was being a bit playful with his metaphor, but I thought it was a nice example.
Thank you, Sam. Tim, any thoughts on this?
Not much more than what I've shared. I mean, our biblical, the Bible that we share, the Hebrew Bible, is full of natural elements, praising God, offering praise to God. A number of so I referred to St. Francis earlier, his lovely Canticle of the Creatures, which is the basis for our wonderful Christian hymn, All Creatures of Our God and King, in which the elements, brother sun, sister moon, Mother Earth, offer praise to God. So there's a pretty robust tradition within Christianity in which the elements in those medieval stories to which I referred earlier, the creatures are seen as capable of offering their own kinds of praise to God. There's a wonderful story of I'm forgetting the name right now, but it's in the Celtic annals, and this brother is walking through kind of a swamp where there are frogs that are croaking and croaking and croaking, and he's just can't abide it anymore, so he bids them be silent, and then he thinks about it and realizes that he's done wrong, and so he enjoins them to do their croaking, and it's sort of a moment of recognition that these frogs are offering their praise to God in the ways that are appropriate to the frogs. They're doing their thing. They're offering their praise. So there's a lot of that sort of lore within the Christian tradition.
Thanks very much. And one more, with your permission, quickly. You each named the long traditions of addressing ecological care in your religious traditions, and yet 2020 was the hottest year on global record. We don't seem willing to change. Do any of you have any hope for human beings to change their values and behaviors? A note to Dr. Ross. And if so, in what does your hope lie? That's a huge question. If you could do it briefly, that would be great.
Am I? I'd love to hear my fellow panelists speak first.
Sorry, you're up, dude.
I mean, I think I'm hopeful. I think you have to be hopeful. I mean, I think one positive development is that I agree that human beings are resistant to change. I mean, this is sort of an age-old observation. But I think that there are ways in which, as technological options, or as technology enables more options and more choices that are not as burdensome for people, I think you can facilitate change. And one example that occurs to me is that I'm not an expert on this topic, but my sense from American historians is that some would argue that part of what facilitated the process of abolition in the world was the Industrial Revolution, when on some level it was no longer felt to be a economic necessity by people who held slaves. They had an alternative through factories, that in some ways facilitated the people's acceptance of the dignity of people and the expectation that people should be thought of as free. And I'm not an expert on that topic. I can't exactly comment, but I can certainly see that as you have more and more opportunities for people. I mean, now, for example, you no longer, take public transportation or drive. You can get a hybrid vehicle. You can get an electric vehicle. I think that as, more and more technologies, now it's, very relatively inexpensive. I mean, I think I was looking at a comparison on prices in Texas, for solar energy versus conventional fossil fuel energy. And I think it's only 0.2 cents per kilowatt hour approximate difference if you want to go green. And I think that as technology makes these choices less difficult, more and more people would be open to change. And certainly human history bears witness to all kinds of wonderful examples of human beings changing for the better. So I'm hopeful, but I don't know what Dr. Robinson, Dr. Rabbi Mecklenburger would say.
I'm full of hope. I think it's very sad that it has taken us several decades of serious warnings from science to start to take it seriously. But if you look at the Paris Accords, if you look at, to get political, at some of the programs for getting rid of our dependence on fossil fuel with the new administration, yes, I think we're finally getting the message. That doesn't mean any particular method is what we need. But I think, around the world, China is becoming a leader in this. So, it can happen.
Thank you very much. I would not put Tim on the spot. I think those answers certainly covering it. But Tim, do you have a final word?
Sure, because I have the minority report here. I am less optimistic, shall we say, than others. And I have little faith in technology because technology is what sort of got us into this mess to start with. And so my hope, and I distinguish hope from optimism. So I have little optimism that we're going to do reverse course. The science tells us that we're on a pretty bad course in terms of the effects of climate change. My hope lies in the abilities of our religious traditions to improvise in the face of, with our imaginations, which we have done for thousands of years. All of these three religious traditions have improvised in the faces of enormous challenges of various sorts over the years, so that we might ask ourselves, what sort of humans do we want to be, informed by our religious traditions? And so I have little faith that we're going to reverse the effects of the carbon that we have poured into the atmosphere over the past couple of centuries. That's not a good scenario. My hope is in the capacities of our various faith traditions and faith leaders to lead people into more imaginative responses to being human in the face of this, to responding to acting toward the more than human creation in more humane ways, to acting toward our fellow humans in more just and sustainable ways as we face this crisis. So that's my dour report, but that's where I find that's where I place my hope.
Thank you very much. Thank you, speakers, once again for your very fine presentations. Thanks for the effort, for taking the challenge and presenting us in such an enlightening way. And thank you, all of you, for attending the lecture here at Brite. We're very grateful for your support of our programs. Stay safe, and we hope to see you once again at our next event. Thanks to all. Bye.